When we think of a medieval winter, our imagination paints an almost fairy tale-like but harsh picture. A snow-covered village, small houses with smoke billowing from their chimneys, and people huddled around the hearth. We read about how they shared a room with animals to keep warm, how they covered the windows with moss and slept on straw mattresses. This picture has become almost textbook. But what if I told you that this is just one of many survival scenarios? That there were other, far more ingenious and sometimes desperate methods that are not written about in textbooks. This is not the story of those who simply shared shelter with their cow. This is a story about those who built thermos houses by going underground, about those who learned to preserve heat in the giant clay hearts of their dwellings, about those who waged a desperate war against all-consuming darkness, creating light literally from fattened reeds. Their secrets are not cozy tales of family hearth, but a harsh saga of human ingenuity on the edge of the foul. Stay with us to the end, and you'll learn why the best house in winter was one that was half a grave. How peasants created heat accumulators that warmed them through the night without a fire. How ice harvest saved them from thirst and disease. What was really eaten when supplies ran low, and why the long polar night of the Middle Ages not only killed, but also gave birth to the strongest of human alliances, sometimes binding two men together in bonds stronger than marriage. This is a story about another winter and other ways of surviving it. Contrary to the image of a freestanding hut blown by all winds, one of the most effective and radical survival strategies was the construction of a winter house, a half hut. Peasants, especially in northern regions with harsh climates or in forest steppe zones where wood was in short supply, intuitively understood what today would be called geothermal energy. The Earth is a giant heat accumulator. At a depth of only 1 or 2 meters, the soil temperature remains stably above zero, even in the bitterest frosts. It was an ingenious solution to utilize this heat. The construction of such a dwelling was a labor-intensive process that required the efforts of the whole community. In the autumn, before the onset of frost, a pit up to 1.5 meters deep was dug. The walls were reinforced with vertically dug timbers or dense wattle and daub, and a low gable roof was erected on top of the central supporting posts, which was covered with a thick pie of turf, earth, and moss. The entrance was made as narrow and low as possible, often in the form of a short corridor, timber with an additional curtain of skins to cut off the flow of icy air. As a result, only a small grassy hill with a primitive chimney or smoke hole protruding from it rose above the surface. Such a house became part of the landscape, merging with it and using it as its main defense resource. Life in such a burrow house was radically different. First of all, it was much warmer. The earth walls did not freeze like clay or stone and did not let in the icy wind. The temperature inside rarely dropped below +5, 77 degrees, even without fire. This was already a huge victory over the frost. Secondly, such a dwelling was dark and damp. The small windows, if there were any, were almost at ground level, covered with bullseye bubbles and gave very little murky light. The air was heavy, smelling of damp earth, straw, and smoke, which did not always escape completely. The acoustics were unique. The howl of the blizzard outside could be heard as a muffled, distant hum, creating a sense of security. But inside, every rustle, cough, or whisper echoed throughout the room, making privacy impossible. This underground life had its own imprint on psychology. The winter was spent in semi-darkness, in an enclosed space, cut off from the outside world. The boundary between day and night was blurred. Time flowed differently, more visceral and slow. People lived in a kind of collective den, like animals hibernating. These houses were often communal, with several families or an entire clan wintering under one roof. This created incredible overcrowding and erased the boundaries of personal space. In this cramped and semi-dark environment, where everyone was in full view, human relations were strained to the limit. Two men who worked together by day and shared a bed of skins at night became each other's sole support. Their lives were so closely intertwined that their union, based on mutual support and warmth, became as normal for the community as any other family structure. Survival dictated its own rules, and human body heat was their main currency. But such closeness was also a test. Any dispute, any personal grudge, was put on public display, requiring the elder of the clan to display great wisdom to settle conflicts that could flare up like a fire in dry straw in a confined space. The Nora House was not just a structure, but a whole philosophy of survival. It did not fight winter, but hid from it, retreating into the embrace of the earth. It was a strategy not of confrontation, but of mimicry and adaptation. It was not just a dwelling, but a living system where the earth gave warmth and people in turn became part of it, its underground children waiting for the rebirth of the world in spring. But even the deepest dugout needed a source of fire, and here too the peasants invented something more perfect than a simple hearth. The open hearth in the center of the room, familiar to us from many descriptions, was wasteful and dangerous. Most of the heat escaped into the chimney with the smoke, and an open fire was a fire hazard. A more advanced and ingenious technology, which changed the very principle of heating, was a massive earthen or stone stove. It was not just a source of fire, but a real heat accumulator, the heart and soul of a winter dwelling. This furnace was a huge, massive structure occupying almost a quarter of the entire dwelling. It was built of clay, river mud, and stones, carefully mixed with straw or horsehair for reinforcement to avoid cracking. It was a sacred act in which the whole family participated, the creation of the main amulet of the house. Inside, there were complex, winding smoke channels, a veritable labyrinth for the fire. The principle of its operation was ingenious. The furnace was heated once, at most twice a day, burning large quantities of wood. The hot smoke traveled through these long internal labyrinths before going out, giving all its heat to the massive walls of the furnace. It was a smoke stove, but with a trick. The smoke did not go out directly, but through a complex system, maximizing efficiency. A huge mass of clay and stone was slowly heated, and then, over a period of 12-18 hours, evenly gave off soft, radiant heat to the entire room. This changed the way of life dramatically. There was no need to keep the fire going all the time. Having heated the stove during the day, one could sleep warm all night without fear of freezing or suffocating from smoke. It was a much safer and more economical system. The furnace itself had a life of its own. It hummed and crackled when it was burning, and when it cooled down, it made quiet clicking noises and sighs like a huge sleeping animal. The upper surface of the stove was flat and wide. It was a bed, the warmest and most honorable place in the house, which was usually reserved for old men, the keepers of the wisdom of the family, and children, its future. Sleeping on a warm stove was the height of comfort and luxury for a peasant. It was also used to dry wet clothes, shoes, grain, mushrooms, and medicinal herbs, whose aroma mixed with the smell of heat and smoke. Small niches were often made in the side walls of the stove, where pots of food were placed to keep it warm for a long time, or where the most valuable things were stored to protect them from dampness. The oven was a multifunctional center of the house. The construction of such a stove was a complex art, the secrets of which were passed down from generation to generation. Its efficiency and safety depended on the proper design of the chimneys. An improperly constructed stove could smoke, filling the house with acrid smoke, or worse, led to carbon monoxide poisoning, which was called stove spirit. It was believed that each oven had its own keeper, who had to be pleased by leaving small offerings for it to breathe properly and keep warm. This technology created a completely different level of comfort. The heat was constant and even, without sudden changes in temperature. It did not come from an open flame, but from the stove itself, creating a feeling of living, breathing heat. This domestic volcano, which woke up once a day to warm its occupants through the night, was a true engineering marvel of a medieval village. It made it possible not just to survive, but to live in winter with relative dignity. But even the best stove could not defeat the main enemy of winter, the all-consuming darkness. The long winter nights of the Middle Ages weren't just dark, they were absolutely impenetrably black. For a peasant whose world was filled with belief in spirits, demons, and other evil, darkness was not the absence of light, but the presence of evil that lurked beyond the threshold. Fighting this darkness was a daily ritual that required as much ingenuity as fighting the cold. The main and cheapest source of light was a lucina, a thin, long sliver of dry wood, most often birch or pine. It was inserted into a special lamp, a metal stand, and lit. It burned quickly, smoked desperately, filling the room with acrid smoke that irritated the eyes and lungs and gave very little light. This light was only enough to illuminate a small patch around it, leaving the rest of the hut in frightening, dancing shadows. It had to be constantly replaced, and one of the children usually sat nearby, responsible for replacing the chips in a timely fashion. In one long winter's evening, a whole pile of firewood could be burned. Making them was an important part of the fall work. A more advanced source of light was fat lamps. These were simple clay or metal pots into which animal fat, beef, pork, or vegetable oil, if there was any, was poured, and a wick made of moss, hemp, or a piece of cloth was lowered. Such lamps burned longer and gave a more even light, but fat was a valuable foodstuff, and it was wasteful to waste it on lighting. They also gave off an unpleasant, heavy odor of burning fat. The height of ingenuity were tallow candles or dipped candles. They were made by repeatedly dipping the wick in melted animal fat until a sufficient layer had built up on it. It was a labor-intensive process, and such candles were saved for special occasions, holidays or rituals. Wax candles that burned clean and bright were an incredible luxury, available only to the church and the wealthiest aristocrats. A special art was the creation of long-lasting lamps, mokals. These were pots filled with grease, in which a float with a wick floated, which allowed the fire to burn longer and save fuel. The struggle for light was not just a mere domestic necessity, it had a deep psychological and ritual meaning. Fire in the dark was a symbol of life, order, and protection from the spirit world. It was believed that the evil power was afraid of light. Therefore, even the dullest flame of a beam in the corner of the hut was not just a light, but an amulet, a small fire on the border between the world of people and the world of chaos. This eternal struggle of light and darkness played out in every house every night. In this almost perpetual darkness, people grew closer. Family or neighbors gathered close to the only source of light. In this small, wavering circle of light, evenings were spent. Men mending harnesses, women spinning, and one person telling stories. The voice of the storyteller, sounding in the semi-darkness, acquired a special magical power. In these conditions, oral tradition, epic fairy tales were born. Darkness forced people not to look but to listen, not to see but to imagine. And that was its paradoxical creative power. But in order to tell stories, one had to be fed, and food had to be obtained by the most desperate means in winter. If nature was generous in summer and fall, in winter she locked all her storerooms with an ice lock. It was the main task to preserve the harvested crops and scarce supplies until spring, and life depended on it. And here the peasants used the very enemy, cold, as their ally. They created primitive but ingenious refrigerators based on a deep understanding of the properties of the world around them. One such invention was the ice cellar. It was not just a cellar. In the fall or early winter, the ice harvest began in a deep hole dug under or near the floor of the house. Men from the whole village would go to the river, cut huge blocks of clean ice from it, and transport them to the cellars on sledges. The ice was tightly compacted in the pit, overlaying each layer with sawdust or straw. This ice monolith was covered with a thick layer of straw, peat, and earth. Such a glacier could keep negative temperature until spring and sometimes until summer. The most valuable and perishable products were stored in it: meat carcasses, fish, oil. It was the only way to keep them from spoiling and provide protein for the family in the middle of winter. Another trick was the use of snow. Food wrapped in hides or birch bark was simply buried in a deep snowdrift. The dense snow was an excellent insulator that maintained a stable low temperature and protected the supplies from rodents and predators. Each family knew the location of their snow cellar and dug it out as needed. But the main method of preservation, which did not require cold, was fermentation. Fermented cabbage, pickled apples, pickled mushrooms, fermented dairy products. All this was not just a way to diversify the diet, but a necessity of life. Fermentation not only preserved the food, but also enriched it with beneficial bacteria and vitamins, especially vitamin C, the deficiency of which caused scurvy. Sauerkraut was to the medieval peasant what lemons were to the sailors of the age of exploration, a salvation from a terrible disease. This process was also surrounded by rituals. It was believed that cabbage should be salted on certain days, with a good mood, otherwise it would take offense and spoil. Grain was stored in special granary pits dug in dry soil and burnt inside to protect it from moisture and pests. It was also stored in barns on stilts to protect it from rodents. Seeds for the future harvest were stored separately, in the driest and most protected places, in sealed earthen vessels, a pledge of the future, which was treated with an almost religious awe. The ability to properly prepare and preserve food was the main knowledge of a housewife. Her skill depended on whether the family would starve in February or reach the first spring greens. The process of cooking was collective. Women together salted cabbage, dried mushrooms, shared recipes and secrets. This culture of hoarding and foresight formed a special mentality. The peasant did not live in one day. He always thought about the future, about the coming winter. Every spike harvested, every animal caught, every mushroom was considered from the point of view of how it could be preserved. It was a continuous war with entropy, with the natural process of decay, and in this war, cold and fermentation were his main weapons. Even with the best preparation and austerity, supplies could run out. February and March, popularly called the hungry months or wolf time, were the worst period, when the previous year's harvest had already been eaten and the new one was still a long way off. During this period, peasants had to turn to the forest of last hope, their last line of defense against starvation, foraging for food that we would today consider completely inedible. It was a time when human ingenuity and desperation reached their peak. When they ran out of grain, they used tree bark. This was not an act of blind desperation, but a whole technology. The peasants knew which layer of bark was edible. The inner, soft layer of pine or birch bark, cambium, was carefully scraped off, taking care not to damage the tree itself so that it could survive. The bark was boiled for a long time to get rid of its bitterness, then dried in the oven and ground into flour in stone piles. This bitter, resinous flour was added to the rest of the real flour to increase its volume, or baked into stone-hard cakes. Such food had little or no nutritional value and was heavy on the stomach, but it gave the illusion of satiety and allowed you to cheat the agonizing feeling of hunger. They also ate acorns, which were collected in the fall. They were soaked in several waters or buried in river mud to get rid of their poisonous bitterness, then dried, pounded, and cooked into a thick, dark porridge. Edible roots, such as burdock, wheatgrass, or reed, were dug out from under the snow, guided by dry stems. Lichens, especially Icelandic moss, and other mosses were collected and boiled for hours at a time to make them at least somewhat edible and to extract bits of nutrients. Hunting in the Lord's forest was strictly forbidden. For killing a deer or a boar, a peasant faced the death penalty or blinding. But hunger was more terrible than the law. It was a quiet, guerrilla war. Peasants, risking everything, set cunning snares and traps made of horsehair and willow twigs in the forest for small game. Hares, squirrels, forest birds. The capture of even a small bird was a great success, a real feast. The carcass was used completely, down to the last bone. The meat was eaten, the skin was used to make warm mittens or shoe linings, and the bones and giblets were boiled for a long time to get some broth. They caught mice and rats, which were permanent inhabitants of their dwellings and barns. Although it seems disgusting to us, the rodent was a valuable and affordable source of animal protein in times of famine. In the most desperate times, things were eaten that today are only horrifying. People have been known to eat carrion, the corpses of animals killed by cold or disease. It was a huge risk, risking poisoning and death, but there was little choice. This survival diet was a severe test for the body. It led to exhaustion, avitaminosis, especially scurvy, diseases of the digestive system, and loss of teeth. People became weak and apathetic. But this diet made it possible to survive until the first nettles or sorrel would emerge from under the snow, a sure sign that winter was receding and that real living food would soon appear. This experience of desperate hunger was forever imprinted in my memory, making me appreciate every piece of bread and every handful of grain as the greatest gift. We rarely think about water as a problem of winter survival. But for the medieval peasant, when rivers, lakes, and even wells were covered with a thick layer of ice, fetching water became a daily, hard, and dangerous job, a real battle with the elements. If there was an unfrozen river or a stream with a fast flow near the village, it was a great fortune. But more often than not, the water sources froze. The peasants had to cut an ice hole. It was hard physical work, requiring an axe or a pawn. The edges of the hole froze quickly and had to be constantly cleared. Going to an ice hole, often far from the village, on ice as slippery as glass, with heavy wooden buckets, was a risky venture. One could slip, fall, smash the precious bucket into splinters, get injured, or, worst of all, fall through the ice. In icy water, in heavy winter clothes, there was virtually no chance of survival. If there were no bodies of water nearby, snow and ice became the only source of water. But to get a bucket of water, you had to melt a huge amount of snow. This required a lot of time and, most importantly, precious fuel. Simply bringing a bucket of snow into the house and placing it by the stove was inefficient. Snow full of air melted very slowly. The peasants came up with a trick. They used the heat of the stove itself. A large cauldron or trough was placed on the hot surface, with some water poured to the bottom. Then gradually, in small portions, they added densely compacted snow or pieces of ice. The melted water accumulated, and the process was faster than if a full cauldron of cold snow had to be stoked. The resulting water also had to be boiled to make it safe, which required even more fuel. Water was therefore preserved as a great treasure. It was used primarily for drinking and cooking. There was hardly any water left for washing and laundry in winter. Hygiene was relegated to the back burner. People went weeks without washing, wearing the same dirty clothes, which led to skin diseases and the spread of lice. But the choice between cleanliness and survival was clear. Water conservation was the law. Getting water was a collective task. Men together cut and supported the ice hole and protected each other. Women, often in groups, went to fetch water, helping to carry heavy buckets and guarding against dangers. Bringing a bucket of water to a lonely old woman or a sick family was considered the greatest act of mercy. This daily battle for water was another reminder of how vulnerable humans were in the face of the elements. What we get with a simple turn of a tap, for them, was the result of hard and risky labor. Every sip of warm soup or heated ale was doubly valued because it was not only food but also hard-won water. Winter was not only a time of passive waiting and survival. The long, dark evenings when work in the field was impossible became a period of active domestic craftsmanship. It was not a pastime, but a necessity of life, preparing for the new season, mending the old and making the new. This monotonous, meditative labor was not only beneficial, but also helped to keep one's sanity confined, preventing discouragement and fear from consuming the soul. The main occupation for women was spinning and weaving. During the year, wool was saved up, and in winter it was time to process it. Women spent endless hours with a spindle or at a primitive loom, creating coarse but strong homespun cloth. The process was almost sacred. The rhythmic whirring of the spindle and the monotonous clatter of the loom became the soundtrack of winter evenings. This fabric was then used to sew new clothes and mend old ones. Every thread, every flap was counted. Old clothes were not thrown away, but were torn into patches or used for rags. The skill of a housewife was determined not only by her ability to cook, but also by her ability to dress the whole family. Men practiced their crafts, which required strength and patience. They repaired agricultural implements, wooden plows, harrows, and pitchforks. They prepared them for spring work so that with the first warmth, they could immediately go to the field. They carved new utensils, bowls, spoons, ladles, as well as children's toys, combs, and other household items from the wood harvested in summer. They wove strong baskets from willow twigs and twisted ropes from hemp. They mended and treated leather harnesses for cattle with animal fat to prevent them from cracking in the cold. This work took place in cramped and semi-darkness, by the light of a torch or a grease lamp. It required great concentration and patience. The monotonous, repetitive movements, the spinning of the spindle, the clatter of the loom, the sliding of the knife on the wood, induced a kind of trance. It was a meditation. a way to pass the time, to get away from thoughts of hunger and cold and focus on creation. Wintercraft was also a form of social interaction. People often worked together, helping each other. Men gathered in one hut could repair tools together, sharing advice and tools. In a cramped space lit by a single dim lamp, two men bent over a common work, such as weaving one large fishing net, were learning to move in unison. Their hands, their breathing, their silent understanding became one. This winter intimacy, born of necessity and shared skill, often created bonds that the world outside the cabin walls could neither understand nor name, but which were for them the most enduring reality. By spring, the family did not go out empty-handed. They had new clothes, repaired equipment, stocks of utensils. Winter was a time of accumulation, not only of fatigue, but also of material values created with their own hands. This labor gave them a sense of control over their lives and hope that the new season would be a success. It was tangible proof of their resilience and skill. Physical survival was only one side of the coin. Psychological survival was no less important and sometimes decisive. The long, dark, and cold nights, the endless howling of the wind behind the walls, the fear of hunger and disease, all this created a huge, unbearable pressure on the psyche. In order not to go mad with fear and despondency, not to succumb to the winter longing, peasants created a complex and rich system of beliefs, rituals, and folklore that helped them to comprehend and survive this dark, hostile time. In their minds, winter was not just a season, but a sacred period when the world of the living and the world of spirits converged to a dangerous point. The thinning veil between the worlds allowed not only evil spirits, ghosts, and other evil things to roam the earth, but also the souls of ancestors. The house was the only shelter, a real fortress, and it had to be protected at all times. Protective solar symbols, circles, and spirals were carved or painted with charcoal on the doorpost and wooden shutters. Bundles of strong-smelling herbs, such as thistle, wormwood, or juniper, whose smoke was believed to ward off evil and disease, were hung at the entrance. The hearth or stove was not just a source of heat, but the sacral center of the house, a portal connected with the spirits of ancestors and the homekeeper, analogous to the housekeeper. The fire in it was considered sacred, a part of the heavenly fire, and its extinction was a bad omen, a sign that the family was unprotected. It was forbidden to spit or throw garbage into the fire. Small offerings, crumbs of bread or drops of milk, were made to placate the guardian spirit. To pass the time and impart knowledge, stories were told. They were not just tales to entertain children. They encrypted the rules of survival, moral standards, and the history of the family and community. Stories about heroes who defeated winter or dark forces inspired hope and demonstrated a model of right behavior. Scary stories about spirits taught caution, not to go into the forest at dusk, not to respond to an unfamiliar voice from the dark. There were also practical stories and parables that taught in allegorical form how to properly store grain or what roots could be eaten. The voice of the storyteller, sounding in the semi-darkness with the crackle of a beam, was the voice of the very wisdom of the ancestors. The most important part of the psychological unloading was the winter holidays. First of all, the 12-day period of Holy Week after Christmas, or its pagan predecessor Yule. It was a time when strict prohibitions were lifted and work stopped. People went to visit each other, had feasts, sang songs, and played games. The mourners, wearing animal and spirit masks, went around the houses, symbolizing the invasion of primordial chaos into an ordered world, which, however, ended with the triumph of order and life. These festivals were a collective exhalation, an opportunity to release accumulated tensions and strengthen social ties. There were also special rituals to help the sun to return and hasten the arrival of spring. At the end of winter, a straw effigy symbolizing winter, death, or illness would be burned on a bonfire. The ashes from this fire were scattered over the fields to ensure the future harvest. They baked ritual cookies in the shape of larks, as if calling them to return and bring warmth on their wings. This world, filled with spirits, omens, and rituals, was as real to the peasant as cold and hunger. Folklore was not entertainment, but a sophisticated tool of psychotherapy. It explained the unexplainable, structured time, taught us how to behave, and most importantly, gave us the unbreakable hope that after the darkest night, the dawn would surely come. In some regions, especially where winters were extremely harsh and long, the survival strategy reached its logical limit. Individual farms practically disappeared for the winter, and the whole community turned into a single, living, social cocoon. Several families, or even the whole village, could move to one or two large, specially built winter houses for the winter. This was a radical measure that required a complete revision of the notion of family and personal space. These structures were a hybrid of a dugout and a barracks. They were well insulated, often had a large central stove, and were designed to house dozens of people. Living in such a communal house completely changed the social dynamics. The concept of my family disappeared. Everyone became one big family. The boundaries between the clans were erased, creating a unified collective, resisting external threats. Life was entirely communal. Food was cooked in common cauldrons and distributed by an elder according to each person's needs. Women worked together on handicrafts, sitting shoulder to shoulder and filling the space with the quiet hum of conversation and song. The men worked together to repair tools, sharing the workspace and helping each other. Children were raised together, passing from hand to hand, and each adult was responsible for them. It was a model of primitive communism, dictated not by ideology, but by dire necessity. It saved firewood, food, and most importantly, human effort. Such a life demanded complete renunciation of personal autonomy and the highest level of social tolerance. Everyone was in the open. Every action, every view was discussed and evaluated. Any conflict could become the property of the whole community and had to be immediately resolved by the Council of Elders so as not to upset the delicate balance. The word of the elders was law. Their wisdom and experience were valued above all else. Anyone who went against the collective risked becoming an outcast, which in winter was tantamount to a death sentence. Many social and gender boundaries were blurred in this incredibly cramped environment, where people slept side by side on shared bunks made of planks and straw. Personal affection and sympathy took on great importance. Ties of friendship and partnership became the main mechanism of survival. Two people, no matter what gender, could form a strong union, supporting each other in everything, sharing meals, working together, sleeping next to each other for warmth, having each other's backs in minor domestic disputes. Such couples, cemented not by law but by a common winter, were perceived by the community as a given, as another cell in the complex structure of the collective organism. Their union was valued for its reliability and mutual fidelity, which was a guarantee of stability for all. This model of social cocooning was an extreme form of adaptation. It required sacrifices, but gave the maximum chances of survival. The community as a whole resisted winter. The collective warmth of human bodies and souls was their main weapon. With the arrival of spring, this cocoon disintegrated, people returned to their summer homes, to their families and farms. But the experience of wintering together forever bound them with invisible ties, turning the village into a real clan, capable of surviving any disaster. Survival in winter was not only a matter of warmth and food, but also of fighting the main enemy. Apathy, discouragement, and depression, monotony, darkness, cold, and a constant sense of anxiety could break even the strongest person. Therefore, peasants intuitively developed a powerful antidote, a rich and diverse culture of winter entertainments, games and festivals that ignited the inner sun and did not let the spirit fade away. The main such event was the winter solstice, which later merged with Christmas. It was not just a religious holiday, but the turning point of winter, the great feast of the victory of light over darkness. When the day began to arrive, at least a sparrow's skip, they prepared for it in advance, stocking up on the best foods that could not be touched until the holiday. Even in the hungriest years, they tried to organize a feast, bake special bread, brew festive ale. It was important not so much for the stomach as for the soul. It was an act of affirmation of life, a challenge to winter. Games were an integral part of winter leisure time. On relatively warm days, men could organize outdoor competitions, wrestling in the snow, tug of war, primitive soccer, or ice hockey using sticks and a wooden ball. These active games not only entertained, but also warmed the body, dispersed the blood, and allowed the release of accumulated aggression in a safe form. Inside the huts, they played board games such as mill or primitive checkers carved from wood or made of stones. Dice were played, although gambling was often condemned. But the main entertainment was music and dancing. Someone in the village had a simple bagpipe, a flute, a whistle, or a tambourine. They danced to these simple melodies. The dances were not pair dances, but collective, round dances. The rhythmic, repetitive movements, the stomping of feet on the earthen floor, all this put one into a kind of trance, allowed one to forget about hardships, to warm up and feel unity. Storytelling had a special place. Old people were living libraries, keepers of folklore. Their stories were the main entertainment and school of life for the youth. Children listened with bated breath to the battles of heroes, the wickedness of witches, and the wisdom of saints. There were also special genres. For example, riddles, which developed wit, or humorous, sometimes obscene. Stories which caused friendly laughter, which was the best cure for gloom. Even labor could be transformed into entertainment. Working together, such as husking nuts, picking grain, or plucking wool, was often accompanied by collective songs and jokes. This turned a monotonous duty into a pleasant social event, making the work easier and faster. This whole culture of winter fun was not a luxury, but an elaborate strategy for psychological survival. Holidays structured time, giving a point of reference and a goal to strive for. Games and dances generated physical and emotional warmth. Stories and music fed the imagination and strengthened cultural identity. The peasants realized that in order to survive the outer winter, they had to prevent the inner winter from coming. And their inner sun, lit by laughter, music, and shared joy, shone even in the darkest of times. Medieval winter was a ruthless foe, but the peasants, our distant ancestors, met it with all their might. Their weapons were not steel, but ingenious ingenuity, born in the crucible of necessity. They learned to turn the earth itself into a shelter, to build thermos houses, and to create heat accumulators out of clay and stone. They fought eternal darkness by extracting light from the simplest materials and used cold as their ally to preserve food. Exploring these forgotten strategies is not just a look back in time. It is a reminder of what man is capable of when he acts in harmony with nature, not in spite of it, and when he is supported not by technology, but by another human being. The story of these nameless heroes who overcame countless winters is a great hymn to resilience, wisdom, and an unbending will to live. If you were interested in this journey into the past and you want to know more about how our ancestors solved problems that seem unsolvable to us, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more amazing stories about forgotten tricks and ingenious ideas born in the depths of centuries ahead of you.